There is a particular kind of story that refuses to stay still, not because it is restless, but because it is alive, carried forward on the breath of every generation that found something true inside it, something worth repeating, something worth believing. The story of Jason and the Argonauts is one of those stories, and it has been alive for a very, very long time, long before the first historian pressed stylus to clay, before the philosophers of Athens organized the world into argument and logic, before Rome built its roads across a conquered continent. There was a young man standing at the edge of the sea. He had no kingdom, he had no army. He had only a ship not yet built, a crew not yet gathered, and a quest that most men of his time would have quietly, sensibly refused. He was called Jason, and what he set out to find, a fleece of gold draped over the bough of an oak tree in a land at the very edge of the known world, was not merely a treasure. It was, depending on who you ask, a birthright, a symbol of legitimate power, a divine object imbued with the memory of a god-touched ram that had carried children through the sky. It was, in every sense that mattered in the ancient Greek world, the reason a man would risk everything. And risk everything is precisely what Jason did. The story that bears his name is one of antiquity's great adventure epics. It predates Homer in some of its deeper roots, though it was later shaped and reshaped across centuries by poets, storytellers, and mythographers, who each left their fingerprints on the clay. The most complete version that survives to us today comes from Apollonius of Rhodes, a scholar poet of the 3rd century before the Common Era, who wrote his Argonautica with a mind soaked in the great epics that came before him, and a style entirely his own. But even Apollonius was drawing from something older, something that hummed beneath the Greek consciousness like a river beneath stone. The word Argonauts itself is worth pausing on. It comes from two pieces: Argo, the name of the ship, and nauts, the Greek word for sailor. The Argo, which tradition tells us was designed and partly built with the guidance of the goddess Athena herself, was named for its builder, a craftsman called Argus, and so the sailors of the Argo became the Argonauts. Simple, elegant, and oddly modern in the way it works. A crew defined entirely by the vessel that carries them. There is something quietly profound in that. They were not Jason's men. They were the ship's men. And what a crew they were, gathered from every corner of the Greek world, from Thrace and Thessaly, from Sparta and Athens, from the islands of the Aegean and the plains beyond. The Argonauts included some of the most celebrated heroes the ancient world had ever imagined. Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes, joined them. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider following our show as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Though his story with the Argo does not end where you might expect, Orpheus, the musician whose lyre could move stones and still rivers, sailed at the prow and kept the oars in rhythm with his playing. Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, were aboard. Atalanta, swift-footed, undefeated, in some tellings stood among them too. This was not merely a ship, it was a gathering of legends inside a legend, and yet, for all the glory of its crew, the voyage of the Argo was not a triumphant march. It was something more human than that. It was a stumbling, suffering, wandering journey through a world the Greeks were still learning to imagine, through the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that crushed ships between them like hands closing around a moth, through the land of the Amazons, through storms conjured by offended gods, through islands of temptation and coasts ruled by monsters. It was a journey of loss as much as glory, of doubt as much as courage, and at its emotional center, burning quietly like a coal through every episode, was a love story that the ancient world found deeply uncomfortable and deeply compelling in equal measure. Jason and Medea, the hero and the sorceress, the man who needed saving and the woman who saved him, at extraordinary cost to herself, and eventually to everything she loved. What we will explore together across the hours ahead is not merely the plot of a myth, it is the world that made the myth, the Bronze Age civilization that may have inspired it, the geography that shaped it, the gods who governed it, the very human fears and desires that gave it its extraordinary endurance. We will follow Jason from the moment of his birth into danger, through his education in the wild mountains of Thessaly, to the court of a king who sent him to his death, and watched, astonished, as he sailed away instead. We will cross the ancient sea with him. We will arrive, as he arrived, at the edge of the known world, and then, slowly, carefully, we will bring him home. 6 segments remain. The oars are steady. The wind is at our backs. We begin. Before we can follow Jason across the water, we must first understand the water itself. We must understand the world that produced him, the civilization that dreamed him up, the geography that gave his journey its particular flavor of danger, and the remarkable truth that beneath the shimmering surface of this myth, there are roots that reach down into real history, into real places, into real human longing. The Greece of Jason's story is not classical Greece. It is not the Greece of the Parthenon, of Socrates in the Agora, of marble columns catching the Athenian afternoon light. That Greece comes later, centuries later. The Greece that forms the backdrop of the Argonaut myth is something older and stranger, and, in many ways, more fascinating. It is Mycenaean Greece, the Bronze Age, a world of warlord kings in hilltop citadels, of linear B tablets recording livestock inventories in a script the wider world would not rediscover until 1952, of trade networks that stretched from Egypt to Scandinavia along routes that feel almost impossibly ambitious for their time. This was a world roughly dated between 1600 and 1100 before the Common Era. A world of chariots and bronze weapons, of elaborate burial customs and shaft graves packed with gold. A world that would collapse. Suddenly, mysteriously, catastrophically, in what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, leaving behind ruins and silence and, eventually, legends, because when civilizations fall and literacy is lost, what remains is memory. And memory, passed through enough hands, becomes myth. The Greeks of the classical period looked back at the Mycenaean age the way we might look at a half-remembered dream, aware that something real was there, unable to quite bring it into focus. Their heroes, Troy, the great voyagers, all of it was understood to belong to an earlier and greater age, an age of men who were larger than what came after. And so the myths were not merely entertainment. They were a kind of history, imprecise and gorgeous, that kept the Bronze Age alive in the imagination long after the Bronze Age had turned to dust. Thessaly, the region in northern Greece where Jason was born, and to which he would eventually return, is worth knowing. It is a broad, fertile plain ringed by mountains, among them the great Pelion, where the centaur Chiron made his home in the caves above the tree line. In the mythological world, Thessaly was something of a crossroads. It was the land of Achilles, who would come later. It was a place associated with magic, with the uncanny, with women who knew the properties of herbs and the language of the moon. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place a hero might come from, and exactly the kind of place that might produce a quest. Now, let us speak of Colchis, because if Thessaly is where the story begins, Colchis is where it arrives. And Colchis is where myth and history press their faces together against the glass and peer curiously at one another. Colchis was real. It was an ancient kingdom situated on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. in what is today the western part of the modern nation of Georgia, nestled between the Caucasus Mountains to the north and east, and the sea to the west. The ancient Greeks called the Black Sea the Euxine, meaning the hospitable sea, though this was something of a diplomatic name, almost certainly applied in the hope that flattery might pacify what was in reality a famously treacherous body of water. Unpredictable storms, powerful currents, thick fogs, and shores lined with peoples who had little interest in Greek visitors. The Black Sea was not hospitable. It was formidable. Sailing it was an achievement in itself. And yet the Greeks sailed it, from at least the 8th century before the Common Era, and quite possibly much earlier, during the Mycenaean period itself. Greek traders and explorers were pushing into the Black Sea, establishing colonies along its coast, trading for the extraordinary resources that flowed out of the lands around it: timber, grain, fish, metals, and, if certain theories are correct, gold. Here is where the myth and the geography begin to speak to one another in intriguing ways. The rivers that flow down from the Caucasus Mountains into the region of ancient Colchis. The Rioni River in particular, known to the ancient Greeks as the Phases, carried gold in their currents. Not metaphorical gold, actual placer gold, fine particles of the metal carried down from mineral-rich mountain rock by centuries of flowing water, and the method used locally to collect it for a very long time was to place sheepskins in the shallows. The wool of a fleece is extraordinarily efficient at trapping fine particles of gold dust carried in moving water. When the fleece was removed and dried, the gold remained embedded in the fibers. It would then be beaten or raked free and collected. A golden fleece, hanging in a sacred grove, at the far eastern edge of the known world. The scholars who have traced this connection, and there are many of them working across archaeology, classical studies, and historical geography, do not claim that the myth is a literal account of a trading expedition. Myths are never that simple. But they do suggest, convincingly, that the Argonaut legend may carry within it the cultural memory of real Greek voyages into the Black Sea. Voyages made by Bronze Age sailors in search of wealth and trade, and the kind of glory that comes from going further than anyone has gone before. The myth grew around the memory the way a pearl grows around a grain of sand. Something real at the center, something luminous around it. It is worth pausing just for a moment on the sheer distance involved. The voyage from Iolcus, the port city in Thessaly where the Argo was launched, to Colchis is, by the route the myth describes, something in the range of 1,500 miles, through the Aegean, through the Hellespont, the narrow strait that divides Europe from Asia, across the Propontis, the sea we now call the Marmara, through the Bosphorus, another narrow and current-driven strait, into the Black Sea itself, and then eastward along its southern coast to the Caucasus, in a wooden ship powered by oar and sail, carrying 50 men and their provisions. This was not a journey measured in days, it was measured in months, in seasons, in the complete and radical disruption of everything a man knew as ordinary life. And the world through which they sailed was, from the Greek perspective, a graduated landscape of familiarity becoming strangeness. The Aegean they knew, the islands, the coves, the seasonal winds. All of this was Greek water, Greek knowledge, Greek story. But as the Argo moved north and east, the known world thinned. The reliable charts gave way to rumor. The familiar gods gave way to local powers whose names the Greeks only half recognized. The peoples on the shores were less predictable. The dangers were less catalogued. This is precisely what gave the voyage its mythological power. Every culture that has ever produced great adventure literature understands, instinctively, that the hero must go somewhere the audience has not been. The journey must move from the known into the unknown, from the mapped into the unmapped, from the safe into the genuinely dangerous. The Argonaut myth does this with extraordinary geographical precision. It uses the real anxiety of real sailors about real places to generate something that feels in the bones. The gods, too, must be understood as part of this world. The Olympian gods of Greek myth were not abstract forces. They were personalities. Vain, generous, jealous, playful, terrifying, and occasionally absurd. They took sides in human affairs with the passionate partisanship of spectators at a contest they have wagered on. In the story of the Argonauts, Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, is Jason's divine patron, protecting him with a consistency that borders on the maternal. Athena guided the building of the ship. Aphrodite and her son Eros would eventually intervene at the crucial moment in Colchis, bending the heart of a king's daughter toward a foreign stranger in ways she could not resist and did not fully understand. These were not background figures. They were active participants. And the Greeks who told and retold this story understood that the distance between divine will and human action was very small indeed. The world of Jason, then, is this world. Bronze and timber and wool and salt water. Gods on mountaintops watching the little ship cross the little sea. A civilization at the height of its Bronze Age ambition, not yet aware of the collapse that was coming, sending its heroes outward along the trade routes and the coastlines, looking for gold and glory and the thing that lies just beyond the edge of the map. And somewhere, past the clashing rocks, past the fog-wrapped shores of the Euxine, past the mouth of the gold-carrying river, a fleece, hanging in the dark beneath the trees, waiting. Every hero has a wound that comes before the glory. Not a wound of battle. Those come later, earned in the open, witnessed by others. The earlier wound is quieter than that. It is the wound of circumstance, of being born into a world that has already, before you drew your first breath, arranged itself against you. Jason's wound was a throne stolen before he was old enough to sit on it. And the man who took it was family. That detail, that the villain of Jason's origin is not a foreign king or a monstrous creature, but his own uncle, is not incidental. It is, in many ways, the whole point. The Greeks understood that the most dangerous threats to power were always interior, and they built that understanding into the bones of their greatest stories. Let us begin, then, at the beginning. The kingdom in question was Iolcus, a city in the region of Thessaly that sat near the coast, close enough to the sea to smell the salt on a west wind. Iolcus was ruled by a king named Aeson, a decent man by all accounts, who held the throne legitimately and without particular drama. Aeson had a half-brother named Peleus, and Peleus wanted what Aeson had. The mechanics of the usurpation differ slightly depending on which ancient source you follow. The myth, like all living things, breathes differently in different mouths, but the essential shape is consistent. Peleus seized the throne of Iolcus from Aeson by force. Aeson, stripped of his kingdom, was left alive, in some versions imprisoned, in others merely marginalized, kept close enough to watch his powerlessness become permanent. It was the kind of cruelty that wears the mask of mercy. But Aeson had a son, or was about to, when it became clear that Peleus was moving against the royal family. Aeson's wife, called Alcimede in most accounts, made a decision that would echo across decades and myths and eventually across the whole of the known world. She protected her unborn child by concealing him. When the boy was born, she declared him dead. She mourned openly, performed the rituals of grief, and then quietly, secretly, sent the infant away from Iolcus, away from Peleus and his surveillance and his long, nervous memory, away to the mountain, to Pelion, to Chiron. Now we must speak of Chiron, because no figure in Jason's early life matters more, and because Chiron himself is one of the most fascinating and quietly moving presences in all of Greek mythology. The centaurs, Creatures half human and half horse were, as a rule, a wild and dangerous lot. They were associated with untamed nature, with excess, with the violence that lives just beneath the skin of the world. In Greek myth, centaurs at a feast were something between a warning and an inevitability. They drank, they fought, they disrupted. They represented what happens when the animal is not governed by the rational. Chiron was different. Chiron was, by universal agreement across the ancient sources, the exception to everything the centaurs represented. He was learned where they were ignorant. He was gentle where they were savage. He was, in the deepest sense of the word, civilized, not because civilization had been imposed on him, but because wisdom had grown in him naturally, the way a great tree grows, without being planted or managed or trimmed into shape. He was the son of the Titan Kronos, which made him divine in a way the other centaurs were not. And he had chosen, not been assigned, the life of a teacher. Chiron's cave on the slopes of Mount Pelion became, in the mythological imagination, something like the finest school the ancient world never built. The greatest heroes of the age passed through it. Achilles was raised there. Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine, learned healing from Chiron's hands. Ajax, Theseus, Actaeon. The mountain schoolmaster took the raw material of heroic potential and shaped it, carefully, into something that could survive a world that did not forgive incompetence. And now, to this cave, came a small boy called Jason. What Chiron taught him was not a narrow curriculum. This is worth emphasizing, because the Greek understanding of what a hero needed to know was remarkably complete. It was not enough to be strong. Strength without direction was simply violence, and violence without wisdom was simply destruction, and neither of those things built a lasting name. A hero needed to be able to fight, yes, to handle a spear and a sword, to wrestle, to run, but he also needed to know medicine, because a man who could heal his companions in the field was worth more than one who could only wound his enemies. He needed to know music, because music was not merely entertainment in the ancient Greek world. It was a technology of the soul, a means of ordering the inner life, of maintaining the kind of equilibrium that crisis would otherwise shatter. He needed to know the stars, because the stars were the map. He needed to know the gods, their natures, their preferences, their easily offended dignities, because a hero who moved through the world without divine literacy was a hero walking blindfolded through a room full of drawn swords. Chiron gave Jason all of this. Over the long years on Pelion, the boy became a young man, and the young man became something harder to name. Not yet a hero in the full sense. That requires a quest, and a quest requires a reason, and the reason had not yet arrived, but he was ready, in the way that a blade is ready before it is needed, in the way that a ship is ready in its harbor before the tide turns. He was, by the time he descended from the mountain, 20 years old. Some sources say it was news of his father's suffering that finally called him down. Others say it was simply time, the natural completion of his education. The moment Chiron recognized that there was nothing more the mountain could give him, and that the world below was now the teacher. Either way, the direction was the same. South, toward the coast, toward Iolcus, toward the uncle who had taken everything that should have been his. The descent from Pelion is where one of the myth's most enduring images lives. Jason, coming down from the mountain in the wild clothing of a man raised far from courts and cities, lost one of his sandals crossing a river. The river in question was the Anorus, swollen with spring rain, and the current was strong. In some tellings he lost the sandal helping an old woman across, the old woman being Hera in disguise, which explains the goddess's fierce and lasting affection for him afterward. In others it is simply the river itself that takes it. Either way, he arrived in Iolcus wearing one sandal. This mattered enormously, because Peleus, the usurper king, had been living for years under the shadow of an oracle. The oracle delivered, as the best oracles always were, in terms just specific enough to haunt and just vague enough to misinterpret. Had warned Peleus to beware the man who came wearing one sandal. Peleus had spent years watching for him, watching doorways and harbor steps and market crowds, watching for the single unshod foot that would announce the end of his stolen reign. And then one day, at a festival to Poseidon, a tall young man walked into the city wearing one sandal, and Peleus looked at him across the crowd and felt the specific chill that only a guilty man feels when something he has long feared finally arrives wearing a face. The conversation between them, as the ancient sources reconstructed, has the quality of a chess game played at high speed by two men of very unequal experience. Peleus was a seasoned political operator. Decades of holding power will do that. Jason was young, direct, raised on a mountain by a centaur, genuinely not yet fluent in the language of courts and maneuvering. He announced himself, told the king who he was, made clear, with the earnest directness of the well-educated but politically naive, that he had come to reclaim what was rightfully his father's. Peleus listened, and then Peleus did what experienced rulers do when raw force is inadvisable. He negotiated, or appeared to. He acknowledged carefully the legitimacy of the claim. He expressed a kind of theatrical remorse. And then he offered a proposition. There was, he said, a matter of family honor unresolved, a ghost that needed appeasing. The spirit of Phrixus, the boy who had originally ridden the golden ram to Colchis and whose story was the distant origin of the Fleece itself, lingered, restless, unable to find peace. The Fleece needed to be recovered, brought home to Thessaly where it belonged. It was, Peleus said, a sacred obligation, a matter of piety before the gods. If Jason were truly the man of honor he claimed to be, surely he would not refuse such a task. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of political cruelty. Peleus was not asking Jason to do the impossible in so many words. He was framing the impossible as a duty, as a test of character, as the very thing a hero with Jason's self-declared nobility could not, without contradiction, decline. And somewhere across the water, at the far end of a sea, the Greeks sailed only with their hearts in their mouths. The Fleece hung in its grove, guarded, waiting. Behind it, a dragon that did not sleep. Jason agreed. Of course he agreed. He was 20 years old, trained by the greatest teacher in the ancient world, burning with the specific righteous fire of a young man who has been wronged and has only recently acquired the physical capacity to do something about it. He agreed, the way dawn agrees to follow darkness. Not because it has calculated the odds, but because it is simply what dawn does. He agreed, and then he began to build a ship. There is an art to assembling the right people for an impossible thing, not merely finding the strongest or the fastest or the most celebrated. Those qualities matter, certainly, but the great crews of history, real or mythological, are never simply collections of superlatives. They are collections of complementary natures, of different kinds of courage, of skills that only reveal their value when the particular crisis that demands them finally arrives. Jason understood this, or perhaps the gods who guided his hand understood it for him, because the crew he assembled for the voyage of the Argo was not merely impressive. It was, by any reckoning, one of the most extraordinary gatherings of human and semi-divine talent that Greek mythology ever imagined in one place. Carrying word of the quest and the invitation, come to Iolcus, sail to Colchis, help Jason, son of Aeson, recover the golden fleece and earn a share of glory that will outlast every other thing your life might otherwise produce. The response was remarkable. They came from everywhere, 50 men by the most commonly cited tradition, one for each oar of the great ship, though the roster varies between sources and some ancient lists are clearly more interested in symbolic completeness than strict consistency. What matters is not the precise number, but the quality, the extraordinary, almost implausible quality of the people who answered that call. Let us take them one by one. Not all of them. The full roster of the Argonauts, depending on which ancient source you consult, can run to over 70 names, many of them heroes of regional fame, whose stories have not survived the centuries with the same clarity as the central figures. But the essential crew, the ones whose presence shaped the voyage in ways that echo through the whole of the myth. We begin, as we must, with Heracles. The greatest hero in the Greek world did not need to come. He was under no obligation, not of blood, not of politics, not of divine instruction. He came because he wanted to, because even Heracles, whose own labors were legendary, recognized in the Argonaut quest something worth setting aside his own work for. He brought with him his companion Hylas, a beautiful young man whom Heracles regarded with the deep, protective affection that the ancient world understood as the natural bond between a hero and his chosen companion. Heracles would not finish the voyage. His story with the Argo ends at a harbor on the Asian coast, in grief and searching, and we will come to that moment in its proper time. But his presence at the outset, his willingness to subordinate himself, the greatest of heroes, to the command of a younger and considerably less proven man, lent the enterprise a legitimacy that nothing else could have provided. When Heracles boards your ship, the world takes your ship seriously. Then there was Orpheus. If Heracles represented the outer world of physical heroism, Orpheus represented something the Greeks valued just as deeply, the interior world of art and its mysterious power. Orpheus was the son of the muse Calliope, which made him something more than a merely talented musician. He was, in the ancient understanding, divinely connected to the source of music itself. His lyre did not simply please the ear, it moved the world. Stones rolled toward him when he played, rivers slowed, trees uprooted themselves and leaned in his direction. Wild animals sat down at his feet and forgot what they were hungry for. The practical value of this on a long sea voyage was, initially, not obvious. But Chiron himself had reportedly told Jason that without Orpheus, the voyage could not succeed. The centaur understood something Jason was still learning, that the body of a crew can be strong, and the arms of a crew can be tireless, and the hearts of a crew can be brave, and still the crew can come apart if there is nothing to hold the inner life together during the long, grinding, featureless days at sea, when exhaustion and doubt and the sheer distance between where you are and where you need to be begins to erode even the stoutest resolve. Orpheus was the answer to that erosion. He played at the oars and the rowing found its rhythm. He played in the evenings and the quarrels that had been building all day quietly dissolved. He was, in the deepest sense, the crew's psychologist, their priest, their anchor against despair. Castor and Pollux came together, as they always did. The Dioscuri, the divine twins, sons of Zeus and Leda in the most common telling, were among the most widely worshipped figures in the ancient Greek world, and their presence on the Argo was understood as a direct mark of divine favor. Castor was the horseman, the mortal twin, skilled in the management and training of horses in a way that seems more useful on land than at sea. Until you remember that any crew member of sufficient physical courage and competitive drive is a useful crew member in almost any context. Pollux was the boxer. In an age before codified rules, boxing was not sport. It was controlled violence, and Pollux was its acknowledged master. There would be a moment on the voyage, at the court of a Bithynian king named Amycus, a man who made sport of challenging travelers to fatal bouts, where this particular skill would determine whether the crew survived the encounter. Pollux would be ready. Zetes and Calais were the winged sons of Boreas, the north wind. They were, quite literally, children of the air. able to lift from the ground on great feathered wings and pursue whatever the sky could carry. Their role in the voyage would become critical at a moment involving harpies and an old blind prophet, and we will arrive at that moment in time. But their presence among the Argonauts speaks to something the Greek mythological imagination was quietly insistent upon: that the world was permeable, that the boundary between the human and the divine was not a wall but a membrane, and that on the right kind of voyage, in the company of the right kind of people, you might find yourself rowing beside someone whose father was the wind. Atalanta deserves particular attention because her presence among the Argonauts, included in some ancient sources, omitted in others, tells us something interesting about the way the myth evolved across time and geography. Atalanta was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable figures in the Greek heroic tradition. She was a huntress, raised in the wild, suckled, the myth tells us, by a bear after her father exposed her as an infant. Furious that she was not a son, she grew into something the ancient world found both admirable and deeply unsettling. A woman who surpassed most men at the things men defined themselves by. She was faster than almost any male contemporary. She was a hunter of extraordinary skill. She had wounded the Caledonian boar, a monster that had resisted the best heroes Greece could field. Apollonius of Rhodes, in his telling, excludes her from the Argo's crew, Jason refusing her on the grounds that a woman aboard would cause conflict among the men. It is a moment of pathetic practicality that reads as both deeply human and slightly comic. But other sources include her without apology, and she stands in those versions as perhaps the clearest signal that the Argo was not merely a ship of physical force, but a ship of exceptional individuals, regardless of the category they arrived in. Admetus was there, the Thessalian king who would one day bargain with death itself for more years of life, and whose story intersected with Apollo in ways that reverberate through the wider mythology. Meleager, the hero of the Caledonian boar hunt, sailed with them. Peleus, father of Achilles, who was not yet born but whose shadow falls backward across the whole heroic tradition, took his oar among the rest. Ancaeus of Samos, one of the great helmsmen of the ancient world, would eventually take the tiller. Tiphys served as the primary steersman, guided by an instinct for currents and wind that the Greeks attributed to divine gift. And there was Argus himself, the builder of the ship, quiet, skilled, attentive in the way that makers of things are always attentive, more comfortable with wood and rope and the logic of structure than with the politics of heroic reputation. He came because the ship was his and he knew its secrets better than anyone. If something went wrong with the Argo, a plank stressed beyond its tolerance, a joint worked loose by heavy weather, Argus would know before anyone else and know what to do. In a crew of spectacular heroes, the man who built the vessel was the man the vessel could not sail without. The ship itself was finished. Athena had set into its prow a timber cut from the sacred oak of Dodona, the great oracle tree of Zeus, which had the gift of speech. The Argo, in other words, could talk. It could warn. It could advise. It was not merely a vessel. It was, in some sense, a divine instrument, a living thing shaped from living wood, carrying the voice of the oldest oracle in Greece at its very front, pointed east. They sacrificed to Apollo on the shore at Iolcus. They drew lots for the benches. They loaded the provisions, grain and wine and dried meat and fresh water in sealed amphorae, with the careful efficiency of people who understood that the sea offers no second chances to those who have not prepared. They said whatever needed to be said to the people they were leaving. Some of those words, we can be certain, were never quite right. They never are. And then 50 hands found 50 oars, and the Argo moved. The sea does not care about your preparations. This is something every sailor learns, and learns personally, and the learning is never gentle. You can provision carefully and sacrifice correctly, and choose your crew with extraordinary wisdom, and still find yourself, 3 days out of harbor, staring at a horizon that offers nothing but indifference. The Aegean in particular, beautiful island scattered, deceptively intimate in its geography, has a way of presenting itself as manageable, right up until the moment it isn't. The Argonauts would learn this. They would learn many things on the long water between Iolcus and Colchis. Some of those lessons would cost them, but the beginning was good. The beginning was, by the account of Apollonius, almost idyllic in its energy. 50 heroes at the oars, Orpheus setting the stroke with his lyre, the Argo moving through the northern Aegean with the particular grace of a ship that has been built well and loaded well, and is carrying the quiet confidence of people who have not yet encountered anything capable of diminishing them. They rounded the great peninsula of Mount Athos, that extraordinary finger of land jutting south into the Aegean, whose monasteries would one day make it one of the most distinctive geographical features in all of Europe. They felt the wind shift. They raised the sail. Their first significant landfall was the island of Lemnos, and Lemnos, even by the standards of a voyage that would accumulate extraordinary encounters the way a ship accumulates barnacles, was something genuinely strange. The island was populated entirely by women, the explanation the Lemnian women offered, and there is a studied casualness in the way the ancient sources present this, as though such things required only mild explanation, was that they had killed their husbands, all of them. Every man on the island, dispatched in a single collective act of violent resolution, the details of which the myth handles with a discretion that itself speaks volumes. The cause, depending on the telling, was marital betrayal of a wholesale and insulting kind. The Lemnian men had taken Thracian slave women as concubines and dismissed their wives with a contempt that turned ultimately fatal for everyone involved. The Lemnian women, led by their queen Hypsipyle, who alone among them had spared a life, hiding her father Thoas and helping him escape by sea, greeted the Argonauts with a mixture of wariness and pragmatic interest. Here were men, able-bodied, vigorous, in the prime of their heroic lives. And here was an island in need of exactly that, if it was to survive another generation. The Argonauts stayed. For how long depends on which source you follow. Apollonius is somewhat evasive on the specifics, in the way that narrators are evasive, when the behavior of their protagonists is not entirely heroic. Long enough that the mission was in danger of becoming a memory. Long enough that Heracles, who had remained with the ship rather than going ashore, eventually lost patience, which, coming from Heracles, carried a particular weight that polite conversation could not, and called the crew back to their purpose with the kind of directness that ends debates rather than continuing them. Jason's time with Hypsipyle produced children by most accounts. He left them behind when the Argo sailed. This is presented without particular emotional weight in the ancient sources, which tells us something about the ancient world's understanding of the obligations of a hero in motion. The quest was the primary thing. Everything else, comfort, connection, the ordinary human appetite for warmth and belonging, was secondary. Had to be. A hero who could not leave was not a hero. He was merely a man who had stopped somewhere pleasant. They sailed northeast, through the Hellespont, the narrow strait, barely a mile wide at its tightest point, that separates the European from the Asian shore. Even today, standing on the European bank and looking across at what is now Turkey, you feel the peculiar geographical drama of the place. The current runs fast and cold and purposeful. The water is a deep, unsettled green. It is the kind of waterway that announces itself as important before you understand why. The ancient Greeks understood exactly why. The Hellespont was the gate. Beyond it was the other world. In the Propontis, the enclosed sea between the Hellespont and the Bosphorus, the sea we now call the Marmara, the Argo made landfall on the peninsula of Cyzicus. The king there, also called Cyzicus, received them warmly. He was young, recently married, generous in the way that young kings with something to prove to their new queens often are. He feasted them, he exchanged gifts. The Argonauts climbed the local mountain and surveyed the geography of what lay ahead, the kind of tactical scouting that spoke to the careful preparation Chiron had instilled in at least some of them. They left in good spirits. They should not have left at night. What happened next is one of the myth's genuine tragedies, small in scale compared to what was coming, but perfectly formed in its sorrow. A storm drove the Argo back to the coast of Cyzicus in the dark, and the Doliones, the people of Cyzicus, mistook the returning ship for an enemy raid. Battle broke out in the darkness, confused and terrible. And by the time the dawn came and the mistake became clear, King Cyzicus was dead, killed by Jason's own hand in the dark, neither man knowing who the other was, until it was too late to be any comfort. The grief on both sides was genuine and profound. The Argonauts stayed to honor their accidental victim with proper burial rites, 3 days of mourning, by Apollonius's account, before the winds allowed them to sail again. It was the voyage's first true lesson in the indifference of tragedy. That it can arrive wearing the face of accident, that the world does not always arrange its sorrows along the lines of guilt and innocence. Moving further into the Propontis, they came to the land of the Bebraces, ruled by Amycus, a king of monstrous proportions and straightforward cruelty, who had made a habit of challenging all visitors to a boxing match and killing them when they lost. He was, in the mythological taxonomy, a type the Greeks recognized and had little patience for, the bully elevated to power, the physical intimidator who had mistaken the inability of others to beat him for some kind of cosmic endorsement of his worldview. He challenged the Argonauts with the sublime confidence of a man who has never encountered consequences. Pollux accepted. The match that followed was, in the ancient sources, swift and decisive in the way that encounters between genuine mastery and mere size tend to be. Amycus was enormous and strong, and had killed many men with his fists. Pollux was the son of Zeus, and had been boxing since before most men learned to walk, and he understood the geometry of violence in ways that made Amycus's strength an almost irrelevant variable. The Brycian king died on the shore of his own kingdom, and the Argonauts moved on, and the lesson was filed away with the others the voyage was accumulating. Then came Phineus, and with Phineus, the voyage took on a different quality entirely. Phineus was a blind prophet, blinded, depending on the source, either by Zeus as punishment for revealing too much of the divine plan to mortals, or by Poseidon, or by his own poor judgment in a matter of domestic politics that the myth handles with characteristic obliqueness. What mattered more than the cause was the condition he had been left in. Phineus possessed the gift of perfect prophecy. He could see everything that was coming, for anyone who asked, with a clarity that made ordinary oracles look like guesswork. But he could not eat. The Harpies would not allow it. The Harpies, creatures described variously as winged women or as birds with women's faces, divine instruments of divine punishment, descended on Phineus every time food was set before him. They snatched what they could and fouled the rest, leaving the old prophet in a state of perpetual, agonizing near starvation. He was alive, but barely. He was present, but diminished. He had the knowledge of all future things, locked inside a body that was being systematically destroyed. When the Argo arrived, and Phineus understood who had come, the sons of the north wind were aboard, and they were the ones fated to free him. His relief was so profound that the ancient sources describe it almost as a physical transformation. Here, finally, was the day the future had been promising him. Cetus and Calais rose from the deck on their great wings and drove the Harpies across the sky in a pursuit that carried them far out over the sea to the Strophides Islands, where the goddess Iris intervened, promising that Phineus would be tormented no further. The Harpies departed. The food stayed on the table. The old prophet ate. In gratitude, Phineas told them everything. Not everything that was coming. He was careful still about the limits the gods had set on what he could share. But enough. He told them about the Symplegades, the clashing rocks, the great blue-black walls of stone that stood at the mouth of the Bosphorus where it opened into the Black Sea, grinding together with a sound like the world being unmade, crushing everything that tried to pass between them, leaving nothing but splinters and the memory of a ship. He told them how to get through. Release a dove, he said. Watch how it fares. Then row. Row as you have never rowed. Row as though the sea itself is chasing you, because in that moment it very nearly will be. They thanked him. They rested. They provisioned from the grateful Fenians, who had not watched their king eat a full meal in longer than some of them could clearly remember. And then they sailed north, toward the thunder that did not stop, toward the sound the rocks made when they closed, toward the gate of the world. You could hear them before you could see them. That is the detail that stays with you when you sit with the ancient accounts long enough. Not the sight of the rocks, not the sheer mass of them, the blue-black stone faces rising from the water like walls built by something that had no interest in human scale. The sound came first, a concussive, grinding, oceanic percussion that the Argonauts would have felt in their chests before they understood what they were hearing. The Symplegades announced themselves the way all genuinely dangerous things announce themselves, not with subtlety, but with a completeness that made the body understand before the mind caught up. The clashing rocks stood at the northern mouth of the Bosphorus, where that narrow, current-driven strait opens into the Black Sea. In geography, the place corresponds roughly to what we now know as the entrance to the Pontus Euxinus, and there are scholars who have pointed to the particular behavior of the Bosphorus current, which runs fast and deceptive and has confounded sailors across millennia, as the physical reality that generated the legend, a current that fights you. Rocks on both sides close enough to feel. The optical illusions of spray and fog. It is not difficult, standing in that geography and knowing what ancient sailors knew, to understand how the imagination might translate the experience into something supernatural, into something alive. The Symplegades, in the myth, were alive. Or alive enough. They moved, not constantly, but in response to passage, grinding together whenever something attempted the strait between them and then retreating briefly before closing again. They were less like rocks and more like a test, a question the sea was asking over and over of every ship that approached. Do you deserve to pass? Most ships, the myth understood, did not. Phineas had told them what to do. Release the dove. Watch, then row. The instruction was simple in the way that the most important instructions usually are. Simple to state, requiring everything to execute. Jason took the dove from wherever it had been kept during the voyage, held, perhaps, in a wicker cage below deck, bewildered by the motion and the salt smell, and released it at the prow. The dove flew straight at the gap between the rocks. Every man on that ship watched it go. Orpheus had stopped playing. The oars were still. This was the kind of moment that produces a particular quality of silence. Not peaceful silence, not the silence of a calm evening, but the compressed silence of 50 people holding something collectively inside them that none of them wanted to name. The rocks closed. They took the dove's tail feathers, just the tail feathers. The bird passed through and emerged on the other side, missing that small trailing edge of itself, but alive, flying free, rising into the air above the Black Sea on the other side of the gate. And the rocks, having closed and taken what they could, began, slowly, grinding, to pull apart again. Now, the word passed through the crew, the way electricity passes through water. Instantly, completely, without the possibility of partial transmission. Tiphys at the helm read the retreating rocks with the focused attention of a man who understands that the difference between observation and action, in this particular moment, can be measured in heartbeats. Orpheus found his lyre and played not for beauty but for rhythm. Fast, driving, insistent, the music stripped of everything ornamental and reduced to its essential mechanical function, which was to keep 50 oars moving in perfect synchrony at a pace that the men's bodies were not certain they could sustain. The Argo moved into the gap. What happened in those seconds, and it would have been seconds, only seconds, is described by Apollonius with a restraint that is itself a kind of artistry. The rocks groaned around them. The spray was total. Not rain, not splash, but immersion. The world become water, the sky and the sea indistinguishable for the length of the passage. The Argo shuddered. The stern, the very last part of the ship to clear the gap, was caught, not crushed, caught. The rocks took the stern ornament, the carved decoration of the ship's tail, the way they had taken the dove's tail feathers, as though the price of passage was always some small trailing piece of the thing that dared the crossing. And then they were through. The Black Sea opened ahead of them, wide and grey-green and enormous in a way the Aegean, for all its moods, never quite managed. The Aegean is a sea of islands. You are always in the Aegean, within reach of land. The Black Sea is something different. It is a sea of horizons, of uninterrupted distance, of the particular psychological weight that comes from looking out and seeing nothing that tells you where you are, or how far you have come, or how much further remains. Behind them, the Symplegades went still, permanently still. The myth tells us that the rocks were fated to cease their motion once a ship finally passed between them, that the Argo's successful crossing was not merely the crew's triumph, but the end of the rocks themselves as a living danger. They became, from that moment forward, simply what rocks are: immobile, permanent, no longer interested in ships. The Argonauts had not merely survived the Symplegades, they had retired them. They moved east along the southern coast of the Black Sea, through waters that grew stranger and more unfamiliar with every day's rowing. The land to their right, the Asian shore, was a succession of territories that sat at the outer edge of Greek geographical knowledge. They passed the land of the Mariandini, where they were received hospitably, and where they also suffered their first real loss. Tiphys, the helmsman, died there, quietly, of an illness that the myth does not specify, and that the ancient sources treat with the brevity reserved for deaths that serve no dramatic purpose but must be acknowledged because they were real. Tiphys, who had read the Symplegades current and chosen the exact moment of the Argo's passage, died in a harbor on the Black Sea coast, and Anchias took the helm, and the ship went on. This is one of the things the voyage of the Argo teaches, if you let it. The quest does not pause for grief. The sea does not offer a bay where you can anchor indefinitely and absorb your losses at a human pace. You bury your dead, and you speak what needs to be spoken, and then the wind either comes or it doesn't, and the oars are either in the water or they aren't, and the ship moves east because east is where it has always been going. They passed the territory of the Amazons, those legendary warrior women whose kingdom the Greeks placed consistently on the southern Black Sea coast in the region we now call northern Turkey. They did not stop. The Amazons and the Argonauts regarded each other across the water with the mutual wariness of people who have heard of each other and have decided that the hearing is sufficient acquaintance. The Argo kept its eastern heading. They passed the ironworking Chalybes, whose entire civilization was organized around the extraction and shaping of metal from the mountain rock, one of those moments in the myth where the geography reaches down and touches the historical record. Because the Chalybes were real, documented by later Greek and Roman writers as masters of metallurgy in precisely this region. And then, finally, after weeks at sea, that the ancient sources compress into the rhythmic geography of a coastline unspooling to the east, the mountains appeared. The Caucasus, rising from the eastern end of the Black Sea with an abruptness that must have struck the Argonauts as almost architectural, as though something had deliberately built a wall at the end of the world to mark the boundary between the known and the truly foreign. Snow on the peaks, even in summer. The peaks themselves lost in cloud for much of the day, revealing themselves only in the sharp early morning light as something vast and indifferent and genuinely ancient. And at the foot of those mountains, at the mouth of the river, the Greeks called the Fleece, spreading back from the shore in a complexity of palace buildings and cultivated fields, and the particular organized density of a prosperous kingdom. Colchis. They had arrived. The edge of everything. The place the voyage had always been pointed at. Through the Hellespont and the Propontis, and the Prophet's Table and the Dove, and the grinding rocks and the grey expanse of the Euxine, and the long southern coast, and the deaths and the weeks of open water. The Argo rested on the faces, and the crew looked at the shore, and the shore, in the form of a great kingdom going about its morning business, looked back. Somewhere in that kingdom was a king named Aeetes. Somewhere in that kingdom, in a sacred grove guarded by a dragon that did not sleep, hung the fleece of gold. And somewhere in that palace, though the Argonauts did not yet know it, a young woman was waking to a morning that would, before it was finished, change everything about who she was and what her life was going to be. Her name was Medea. There are moments in a story where everything that came before reveals itself as preparation. All the trials, all the losses, all the long days at the oar when the horizon refused to change, and the men rowed on faith alone because the alternative was to stop rowing. And stopping was not something 50 heroes on a divine mission were willing to name out loud as an option. All of it. The Lemnian harbour, the darkness at Cyzicus, the harpies and the prophet, the dove and the grinding rocks, and the coast that went on until it became the mountains. All of it was the approach, the clearing of the ground, the long preparation for a single, concentrated encounter with the thing the voyage had always been about. That encounter began not on the field where the bulls breathed fire, not in the sacred grove where the dragon coiled around the oak. It began quietly, in a bedroom in the palace of Aeetes, in the sleeping mind of a young woman who woke before dawn with her heart already running. Medea had dreamed of Jason before she met him. This is how Apollonius tells it, with a poet's understanding that the most important things arrive first in the interior life, and only later in the world of events. She dreamed of the stranger and the fleece and understood, in the logic of dreams that bypasses the careful defenses of the waking mind, that something was coming that she could not refuse and could not survive intact. She woke unsettled. She went about her morning, and then the Argonauts came ashore. Aeetes was not a welcoming king. He was powerful, suspicious, and old enough in his power to recognize a threat wearing the costume of a request. Jason came to him with the formal courtesy Chiron had instilled, respectful, clear, honest about his purpose in the way that a man is honest when he is either very brave or has not yet fully understood his situation. He told the king of Colchis exactly why the Argo had come: the fleece, the divine obligation, the restoration of honor to a family and a kingdom across the sea. Aeetes listened with the patience of a man constructing, behind his eyes, something he has no intention of revealing until it is finished. Then he made his offer. Jason could have the fleece. All he had to do was demonstrate his worthiness. The tasks Aeetes set were 3, arranged in a sequence designed to be unsurvivable. First, Jason must yoke the Kalkatoroi, the bronze bulls, 2 enormous creatures fashioned, in some traditions, by Hephaestus himself, whose hooves were iron and whose breath was fire, and who had never been successfully approached by a living man. He must yoke them, unaided, to a great plough. Second, he must use that plough to till the entire field of Ares before sunset. Third, into the freshly turned earth of that field, he must sow the teeth of a dragon. From those teeth warriors would grow, fully armed, erupting from the soil like a harvest of violence, and Jason must defeat them before they destroyed him. Aeetes explained these conditions with the surface courtesy of a man offering a reasonable bargain. Underneath the courtesy was the certainty that no man could do what he was asking, that Jason would die in the attempt, that the Argo would then be his to deal with as he saw fit. And the question of the fleece would never need to be answered because the person asking it would no longer be alive to press the matter. What Aeetes did not account for, what no father of a daughter in any myth has ever adequately accounted for, was Medea. She had seen Jason when the Argonauts were brought to the palace. Apollonius describes the moment with his characteristic mixture of psychological precision and mythological shorthand. Eros, sent by Aphrodite at Hera's instigation, struck Medea with an arrow she never saw coming. The divine machinery of the love story is transparent in its mechanism and entirely beside the point in its effect. What matters is not the arrow. What matters is what happened in Medea afterward. She was the daughter of a king, granddaughter of the sun god Helios, niece of Circe, that other great sorceress of Greek mythology whose island would later trouble Odysseus considerably. She was a priestess of Hecate, goddess of the crossroads, and the moon, and the deep magic that lives in the spaces between known things. She understood herbs and their properties, incantations and their effects, the precise language required to bend the natural world toward an unnatural outcome. She was, in the vocabulary of her own time and place, not merely a clever woman. She was a practitioner of forces that her world took entirely seriously. A serious power, embedded in a king's court, living behind the careful face that daughters of powerful men learn to wear from childhood. And she was in love with a foreigner who was almost certainly going to die in her father's field before the sun went down. The struggle inside Medea, rendered by Apollonius with a psychological depth that has struck readers across 23 centuries as startlingly modern, was not simple. She was not a woman who moved toward her decision easily or without understanding its cost. She knew what helping Jason meant. It meant betraying her father. It meant betraying her kingdom. It meant choosing a man she had spoken to perhaps once, a stranger from a world she had never seen, over everything that had defined her life up to that moment. She lay awake through the dark hours and argued with herself in the way that people argue with themselves when they already know what they are going to do, but need the argument to make the doing feel less like surrender. By morning she had decided. She sent word to Jason through her nephew Argus. They met, secretly, in the precinct of Hecate's temple, and there, in that liminal sacred space between the divine and the human, Medea gave Jason what she should not have given him, an ointment prepared from a flower that had grown where the blood of Prometheus fell, the Titan who had given fire to humanity and been chained to a Caucasian rock for it, his liver consumed daily by an eagle, his wound perpetually renewed, the flower that grew from that divine suffering produced, in Medea's preparation, a substance that rendered the human body temporarily invulnerable to fire and to iron. She told Jason exactly how to use it. She told him exactly what to do about the dragon's teeth warriors, how to throw a stone among them and watch them turn on one another in the confusion of not knowing where the attack had come from. She told him everything, and in exchange she asked only one thing: take me with you. When you leave Colchis, take me away from here. Jason swore by every god he could name that he would. He swore by Zeus and by Hera, and by the sanctity of the temple they were standing in. Apollonius notes this oath with a quietness that only makes it more audible, because the reader, coming to this moment with whatever knowledge they carry of what comes after, knows that oaths sworn in desperate moments under the pressure of love and necessity carry a particular weight, that the gods who are invoked as witnesses do not forget, and that Jason, sailing home with the fleece and the woman who made the fleece possible, was already carrying the seed of something that would not stay buried. But that comes later. On this morning, in the field of Ares, Everything worked. The ointment held. The bronze bulls breathed their fire against a man it could not touch, and Jason yoked them with a steadiness that the watching Colchians, Aeetes among them, jaw tight with a fury he was not yet prepared to act on, could not explain. He plowed the field with a completeness and a speed that exhausted the bulls, and still left time before sunset. The dragon's teeth went into the earth. The warriors rose, helmeted and armed and murderous. Jason threw the stone. The warriors turned on one another with the blind violence of creatures that do not know their enemy, and the field consumed them. Aeetes returned to his palace in silence. That silence was the silence of a man recalculating, of a man who had expected a corpse and received instead a completed impossibility, and who was now revising his intentions in a direction that did not include honoring his promise. He would not give Jason the fleece. He would deal with the Argonauts in the night while they slept. He would burn the ship. Medea knew her father. She moved before he could. She came to Jason in the dark and led all of them, the whole crew moving silent through the Colchian night, to the sacred grove of Ares. The dragon was there, coiled around the oak, enormous and permanent and awake, in the way that divine guardians are always awake, with a watchfulness that does not tire because it does not need to. Medea stood before it and sang. The ancient sources differ on the precise nature of what she did. Incantation, herbal preparation, the direct invocation of Hecate's power. What they agree on is the result. The dragon's eyes closed. Its coils loosened, slowly, with the geological patience of a creature that had not slept in a very long time and found, suddenly, that it could. Jason took the fleece from the oak. It was heavy. Gold is always heavy, in weight, in meaning, in consequence. He carried it to the ship and the crew that had waited through the long night with the particular tension of people who have survived so much that they have developed a superstitious reluctance to celebrate before they are actually moving. And then Medea stepped aboard the Argo. The ship moved onto the Phasis. The river carried them west toward the Black Sea. Behind them, Colchis woke to the sound of a king's rage, discovering an empty grove and a missing daughter and a ship already on the water. The voyage home would be harder than the voyage out. It always is. Medea's brother Absatus would die in the pursuit, a death that darkened the homecoming with a moral complexity. The myth never quite resolves. Circe's island, the sirens, the clashing Symplegades of the Western Sea, further trials and further losses, and the long unraveling of everything Jason had promised in the temple of Hecate. Eventually Corinth and a different king's daughter, and Medea's terrible, magnificent, unforgivable answer to betrayal. The myth does not end cleanly. The myths that matter rarely do. But here, on the Phasis, in the last hour before dawn, with the fleece spread gold across the deck, and Orpheus playing softly at the prow, and 50 oars finding their rhythm in the dark water, here, for one suspended moment, it was enough. They had gone to the edge of the world. They had come back with what they came for. The Argo moved west. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, indifferent courses, and the river carried them, as rivers always carry those who have finished with one shore and not yet arrived at another, into the open dark between.